Hi guys, I'm Mike Minetsky, and this is going to be Headless Drupal architecture patterns. So a little bit about me. I'm the Director of Technology at 4 Kitchens. Been working with Drupal since 4.7, and been working with, yes, and actually a couple of people are nodding with that. I have a very low Drupal number that Chris Drupal keeps telling me is awesome. But actually I started working with Drupal a long time ago, did a completely different career, and then kind of got back into it. But yeah, you can reach me via email, and there's my Twitter. And I've been working with headless sites and architectures for a couple of years now, and it's become a big part of what we've been doing at 4 Kitchens. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to try to define headless a little bit, talk about a little bit about some of the motivations that drive these types of architectures. We'll take a look at some of the things to consider when choosing one of these different architectures that I'm going to go over. Go over the actual different types of architectures that you would be able to approach a headless project with. And then a couple new next steps, new ideas that are even kind of going even farther off the reservation. And I guess more forward-thinking, more interesting, maybe. I don't know. We'll see. So first of all, what is headless? If any of you were in Todd's talk previously, he gave a great description of, and the whole talk is about like this whole idea of the great decoupling. And so right now, in a traditional CMS, for those who haven't been to Todd's talk, you have the front end and the back end all in one system, right? In one application. In a decoupled or headless architecture, the CMS and the front end are in 2 separate applications. But with that, where do you go? Like, what does that mean? There's a lot of different choices that you can make to build a website that has this type of architecture, and this really doesn't dive into kind of like what the actual tactical decisions that you'll have to start making. So before you start understanding what kind of how to make that decoupling work for your project, it's very important to kind of understand what are some of the motivations that are driving organizations to take this type of architecture. So one of the biggest is decoupled upgrades. So, and the biggest motivator behind decoupling the upgrades is really comes from one of the bigger pain points in Drupal, and that is that in Drupal, your redesign is going to likely require a migration or a replatform. And when it comes down to it, the fact that your website is out of date may not really relate to the fact that CK editor is out of date, right? Those two things could potentially, will live on be upgraded in completely different cycles. But with Drupal, you're kind of stuck. And so in every time that you want to redesign the site or a new version of Drupal comes out, you're going to be replatforming. And in the case of Drupal, migrating. And in the case of WordPress, it's still not exactly a walk in the park. The process is a lot smoother, but it's it's still a lot more work and potentially a lot of money. So what a decoupled architecture allows you to do is to be able to stagger those upgrades. So be able to do redesigns that are completely unrelated to your replatform, do your replatform without changing the look and feel of your site. So another reason that a lot of companies are attracted to this type of architecture is to be able to have separate teams that are working really independently. So one of the advantages of building an API site or a decoupled site is that you can have 2 separate teams that are working essentially independently and have a front-end team that is starting much earlier in the process than they would be able to in a traditional architecture. And allowing them to work together and work in parallel is an API. And in this case, the API becomes a contract. And we recently did a build that was actually that really followed those principles. And the project started with an API mockup. And both the back-end team and the front-end team worked from, or in the case of the back-end team, towards that mockup. So as the functionality for the site was being built out, the front-end team was creating templates, and they all came together at the end. So another reason that you might be considering a decoupled architecture or adding an API to your site is if there's multiple platforms that are going to be consuming your content. So there's no longer your content no longer only lives on the web. That is one of those things that is actually in the past, but we're still not really aware of it in our thinking. And you see that with apps like Flipboard. You see that with different types of syndication that are becoming popular. You see that with how much content is being consumed in my smartwatch, your refrigerator, all those kinds of things. And that's where your content is no longer just going to the web. It's going to all these different types of consumers, and each one of them, in a sense, is its own front end and has its own needs and requirements. And there's a great blog post by Dries actually right now on the top of his blog that really talks about this concept itself. And it's his thesis is that we're living in the time of the post-browser web. So that's a pretty big shift, right? So it's time to kind of start shifting our thinking. So there are a number of different ways to be able to approach these types of architectures, and part of the motivation for the biggest motivation for putting this talk together was that people would come to our Headless Drupal class, and there was a very large variety of what people were looking to get out of it. And I wanted to take an opportunity and put some content out there that helps define some of the terms, put some of the case studies that are out there, introduce them, and then also sort of take a look at what are the different drawbacks and advantages. So some of the things that we'll talk about is using Drupal as a static site generator, like Jekyll. Creating one-page apps. Those are like creating an Angular app, something like that. Creating native applications or pushing content to a separate server. An architecture that I actually don't have an example of, but I'm really intrigued by, which is a Drupal site that is communicating to another Drupal site. A blended architecture where you're pulling in this content together, where you're attaching an API for various reasons to an existing site that is being serving its content in a more traditional monolithic way. And then a new idea that's starting to gain ground, and something that lots of organizations are coming to us asking for, which is a syndication hub. So a way to share content between different types of organizations with perhaps permission rules and things like that, or standardized formats. And then finally, I want to touch on Isomorphic Frameworks, which, as far as if we're living in the post-browser web, I think the future of the browser is with Isomorphic Frameworks. So, those are the different types of architectures, but how do you decide between them? It's a difficult decision. There's a lot to consider. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll have a little bit more idea as to which direction to go towards. But when you are starting to make that decision, these are some of the things, not an exhaustive list, but some of the things that you have to start thinking about now. The reason that you didn't have to think about it before today, before building that decoupled site, is because all of these things were handled by Drupal for you, and a lot of them in sort of magical ways that you don't really think about. So routing, clean URLs and navigation, those potentially are separate systems and handled in different ways, but just happen for you for free in Drupal. Caching. How is that going to work? Where is the caching going to live in your application? Is it going to be Drupal caching and then varnish in front of it, or is your front-end application going to have its own cache of the data from Drupal? Templating. What templating engine are you going to use? In Drupal, you don't have a choice. In Drupal 8, you really don't have a choice. It's going to be Twig. But if you're looking at these decoupled applications, there's a wealth of different templating engines like Handlebars, Dust, Mustache, etc. A really big important one is interactivity. There's no form API, right? So that changes everything. And then, of course, authentication, permissions, user actions, all of those things. If you're going to have a public API, you have to start considering things about how you're going to authenticate against that API, which is going to be very different as to how you're authenticating users to log into the website. Because APIs have kind of very different requirements when it comes to authentication. Same thing with provisioning users. And then finally, if you are building a public API, there's a lot to consider when it comes down to API mechanics. How are you going to version your API? How are you going to do error handling? How are you going to do documentation? If you're in the class, the RESTful module actually does a good job of setting a framework for you to be able to work with and giving you some good ideas as to start with. But there's a lot of choices that still need to be made. And this talk isn't about trying to give answers. It's really about trying to make sure that people are asking the right questions before starting this type of project. So this is, at least consider these things before you start building. Okay. So let's jump into some of these architectures. The first one is a static site generator. So how many people here are familiar with Jekyll? Most people. Okay. Jekyll is probably the most well-known static site generator, but it's certainly not the only one. The idea behind the static site generator is that you would render HTML and put it on a file system in a server and let something like Nginx or Apache serve those as though they were just handwritten files. So what is it good for? It's great for one-off sites, for marketing sites. It's great for sites with infrequent edits. So if you're creating a website like a marketing site, and actually 4kitchens.com is a Jekyll site, because it gets updated maybe once a month. Our blog is Drupal, but our website is Jekyll. Another note that isn't on this slide, that kind of just came to me now, is that it's great for sites that are fire and forget. So like a marketing microsite that you're going to create, and you're never going to have to worry about it again. If you build that site with Drupal that you're only going to create once, you still have to do security upgrades on it all the time, right? But if you just build it as flat HTML files, it can just exist forever, and there will never be a security concern related to it. You'll never have to update it. It won't break. It won't change in any way. So that can be a pretty good reason to look at static site generators, and actually a lot of organizations that are either consolidating content or moving content end up creating static versions of their sites before upgrading or something like that. And that happens a lot with Drupal camps. Now we did that with Drupal Camp Austin. We crawled the whole site and then created a flat version of it, and then just moved on. So, like I said, fire and forget. It's a very lightweight way of serving a website. It can be very high performance because you're not bound by Drupal bootstrapping and loading just to be able to serve an HTML page. It is just an HTML page. The hosting is by far the simplest and the easiest to scale. You could even probably host this with like Bluehost or GoDaddy, right? I mean, this is like, right, it's about the level that they can handle. But there's no database to worry about, and again, it's very high security because it's just an HTML page. And you can put your entire editing situation behind a firewall and never have to worry about that being out on the web in any way. So there are some pretty big drawbacks. Well, one of them is that it's a build on each edit, which for a simple site may not be very, may be very inexpensive and very easy to facilitate. For a site that has a lot of interconnections and a lot of entity relationships, that will, no matter how the system is architected, may require a rebuild of all kinds of different pages. And that can be very expensive, and if you have very frequent edits, it's really not going to be a viable option. It's also going to require a completely separate system for any type of user interaction. Right? An HTML page can't process a form. So you'll have to look at either third-party services or look through a separate way of hosting that those types of interactions. That may or may not be, that may be a good way for you to go. On our site, there is actually just one page one form that actually goes back to a separate server than what actually serves our web page, and that's it. But that's all we need. We're a small company. We have a pretty simple marketing site, and that works for us. So, if you were interested in doing this in Drupal, there is actually a path forward, and that's called Zeriz. It's built by the same folks who built the RESTful module, which we've started to use for most of our API work in Drupal. It's a pretty interesting way of approaching the problem, using organic groups as a way to organize the static site, it has a yeoman generator where you can generate a site from a Drupal essentially API, and they have quite a bit of content on their site about it. So if that's something you want to pursue, it's certainly worth taking a look at. And of course, there's Jekyll. And another couple worth mentioning are something called Baked.js and Roots.js. Both of those are static site generators that are built on Node.js. Okay. So the next one I want to touch on is a single page app. So a single page app is what you get when you build something with Angular. The big difference here is, or with React, or with Ember, one of the other JavaScript frameworks. The big difference here is when you're building a single page app, is that you would load a HTML page that has JavaScript attached to it, and then all of the subsequent page loads on it would be routed within your browser, and they may get more content, but you're never actually leaving that one single page when it comes to the page load. Okay, so this is great for building web applications. It's really awesome for building web applications. One site that comes to mind is SoundCloud, which is a music hosting site. You can keep playing the same song as you keep browsing the site. Really, the only way to facilitate that is to not reload the page.
What's the site again?
SoundCloud. And I don't know what framework it's built with, but that's 100% of a single page app. And there's tons of examples of this, and this is a huge, single page apps are very popular right now. Still hot right now. All right. But it's not necessarily the best way to build content sites. The way that it works is that as I said, the routing and templating is in the browser. It's very, very performant for subsequent page loads because you're only getting the difference, right? You're not loading all the HTML that surrounds the new content. You're just loading the data parts of the new content, right? Just the stuff between the HTML tags, and that can be potentially very performant after you get that first page load. And as far as architecture goes, it can be very simple. The drawbacks are, on a complicated site, there can be very poor performance on the initial page load. That becomes especially dangerous and problematic on mobile devices, where you would not only have to take a fairly heavy page to load it into the phone, but you would then have to wait for the phone to actually create all the templates from the data, create all the HTML from the templates and the data. right? And if you've ever experienced the frustration of waiting for a page to load when you're just trying to find something out, that's where these kinds of things, kind of really start being important to consider. Another problem is that JavaScript is just plain required. Single-page apps don't work without JavaScript at all. You have to figure out some other way to be able to serve content to users that don't have JavaScript enabled or available. So that creates potentially big SEO challenges. It also creates potentially big accessibility challenges. And those can be, should be important concerns for anyone. Now, is that to say that this is inappropriate for every application? Absolutely not. When you think about it, Gmail is a single-page app, right? Now you're loading an application to read your mail. You're not loading a site of content that is your mail. So it's a different experience. So an example of this was actually by a company in Costa Rica, and they did a case study at the last Drupalcon. They made a static site. They made a single-page app that allows users to mark where there's contraband being sold, which is like a problem in Costa Rica, and on a map. And be able to then see where other places, to essentially report contraband being sold. And this really makes sense, because without the map, which requires JavaScript anyway, this website doesn't really do anything, and there's nothing there without it. So if your application doesn't work without JavaScript anyway, or your content doesn't make sense without JavaScript anyway, a single-page app might really make sense. Now, consider the performance and scalability issues as well, but it's certainly not a non-starter. So the next type of site is a little bit hard to name. Because it's really is just it's another application that is serving as a proxy and templating engine for the API. Best I can come up with is native. And the idea there is that you would have an application that sort of serves as a bit of a caching layer and templating layer, allowing the front-end work to happen completely separately, but not running into the same limitations that you have with a single-page app or with a static site generator. So you're still using a database, and a lot of times it's Redis or MongoDB or something cool like that, that you're storing your cached Drupal data in, and then using a templating engine to create content from that, to create HTML from that content and the templates. So it's a great solution for content-heavy sites. It's a solution that we've used the most here at 4 Kitchens. And it's very versatile because it eliminates the problem that you have with not being able to provide navigation in the problem you have with the single-page apps where you can't provide navigation to users without JavaScript. And it kind of combines a little bit of the best of both worlds in that you have a server serving that content to new users, and you could potentially build in XHR requests to be able to get subsequent page loads. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the isomorphic frameworks. So it has the best performance for initial page load. It can certainly be used in conjunction with client-side templating, and it's going to be the most familiar type of architecture when you're kind of trying to noodle this out and kind of build these types of sites. It's going to make more sense, perhaps. So, but there are drawbacks. And the first drawback really kind of goes to a lot of these types of decisions is it really worth it? is whatever your application that you're building or whatever site that you're building are the advantages that you're going to get by decoupling, either in the project level or in the architecture level, going to be worth the added work and sort of new ground that you'll have to go through to be able to make that work. You have to build a system to be able to preview the content. You can't necessarily just sort of hit the preview button in Drupal. Caching is a really hard problem. There's like that joke, right? Then everybody who hasn't really dealt with caching has heard somebody say caching is hard. Caching is really hard. So keep that in mind. Interactivity and authentication can potentially be complicated because now you have this other site that's actually serving the content to your users, or other application rather, that isn't necessarily have any connection to the Drupal site. So you have to kind of either treat the logins as a separate system that's going in or that's working like a third-party JavaScript app. And start worrying about cross-site scripting and things like that you don't have to consider with a Drupal site when you're just sort of serving HTML. So an example of this type of architecture is twit.tv. Actually just recently did a webinar talking about kind of going into the gory details of this. It was partnered with Pantheon and another company called Pixo. And Pixo actually did their portion of the webinar was on a almost identical architecture using WordPress as the backend. So it was pretty cool seeing kind of comparing, contrasting both of those. So if you want to dig deeper, there's an example. And another example, Drupalcon Austin this time, is the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. So, and this was the big first one that we built. And shortly after that, and the only reason it's not in here is because we don't have a case study about it, is the SNL app and site. And all those were built with this type of an architecture, where you have Drupal acting as an API, and then you have a front-end application that is caching data and then templating it. So one of the weirder ones that I've heard about is decoupling Drupal with itself. And I can tell by the faces that people are like, "What do you mean? Why would you do that?" And that was my first reaction. But then I thought about it. I was like, it totally makes sense. Why use a different technology if you're really familiar with Drupal? It actually does a pretty good job of making web pages. I mean, that's what we all use it for. And it's got a great editor experience. Nobody can argue with that. And if you want to have some of the benefits of decoupling, why not just use two Drupal sites? You can consume a Drupal site with feeds. And it's actually something that you'd be able to build with the community tools that are out there. You'd have to kind of think through a couple things, but it's there. So yeah, I mean the idea is that you'd separate concerns, not technologies. Edit content on one Drupal site and render it in another. Yeah.
An example of where Drupal could be useful, we looked at this for one of our clients, is internally they had a number of systems that they wanted to consolidate information from, even have an internal dashboard for. And a lot of that data, or subset of that data, would need to go to a client site, consumer-facing site. And so both being Drupal meant their devs didn't have to learn all kinds of
new technologies.
And
exactly.
they had all the nice admin screens for, that's a cool way.
Awesome. Do you have a case study somewhere that I can link to?
No. That was just a proposal that hasn't been done.
So for the recording, a gentleman here mentioned that they actually built a system similar to that because they had a client who had a centralized content store that had to feed certain client sites and actually use a very similar architecture to this. And you may or may not have used something like this similarly. I mean, if you have one Drupal site that's pulling down an RSS feed from another Drupal site, that really is an API-driven decoupled site architecture. So the advantages are that it's a simplified technology stack. you're going to, if you already know Drupal, you don't have to learn Drupal again to be able to take advantage of a lot of the advantages of decoupling. It's a simplified posting stack. You can put both of them up on Pantheon or Acquia, and you probably know how that stuff works. Some of the drawbacks are you don't get all the benefits of the front-end tools that you would if you were building this with Node.js or a more lightweight custom-built PHP app or something like that. Again, the added complexity, like, you're really going to have to weigh it. In this gentleman's case, it really makes sense. If you have one set of content that you need to feed to different sites that get a subset of it, absolutely, that makes sense. And then, it feels really weird. I don't know, I feel like I've totally had this drunken conversation at some point, and it's like, what would be cool? We could build one Drupal site, and they could take in the other Drupal site. I don't know. A blended architecture. So all this talk about decoupled sites, and all this talk about APIs. You don't need to go headless to have an API, and you don't need to go headless to be able to use Angular. Drupal, no matter how much we want to decouple it, is still really good at making web pages. And using some of these other technologies can certainly be used in tandem with it. And that's something definitely to consider if you're thinking about if your use case or your need is that you need to be able to feed content to other sites. You don't necessarily need your website to dog food that API if that API is just feeding one app that you have internal developers building. An example of that, and a very good, very big, high-profile example of that is Media Current's recent work on the Weather Channel. On weather.com. There's a great Drupalcon LA presentation kind of talking about that, how they built it. Took advantage of edge side includes to be able to load portions of the page individually and serve very diverse content to very diverse audiences, right? Because the weather is different in every part of the country, so it's kind of, again, difficult to cache. So definitely something really worth considering when building these types of, when considering whether you want to go headless or not. So I wanted to touch on isomorphic frameworks. This is a bit of the bleeding edge, and the idea here is that you would have the same templates, the same routing on a server and on a single page app. So that no matter what route a user reaches, they would, if they're a new user who hasn't previously loaded the page, they would get the full page rendered on the server. If they click on and if that page happens to be a list of articles, and they click on an article, that article would then be, the route would happen within the browser, and the templating would happen within the browser. So this really is the best of both worlds. It allows you to build much simpler architectures because you're using the same logic on the front end and on the back end. Where Drupal would sit in all this is it would be an API feeding into an isomorphic app, but it's certainly something that you should consider. And if you're super on top of it in Lullabot, you may have actually built your site that way. It's a pretty cool move. I just found out about this yesterday, and I was super excited, and really digging into and bothering them, find out more about how they built it, what are the problems they ran into, and how it works. Because this is cool. So, if that wasn't enough, so isomorphic frameworks, all these different types of architectures, it gets even better, and there's even more things to start considering. One of them is a syndication hub, and that sounds actually a lot like what this gentleman was using. This is where you would have a centralized content store that Drupal would publish to. That content store might be very simple and work like a cache, or it might be more complicated and have validation and perhaps permissions and groups of content and things like that. So a content aggregator. A really cool example of this, and if you want to understand more about like how what are some of the problems with building a syndication hub and how to approach it and how to build an API that facilitates this, is something called the public media platform. It is the way that all the different public media entities like PRI, NPR, APM share digital content between each other. And that goes between those organizations and then between the hundreds of stations that are out there that are both creating content and consuming content. They used a very interesting internal API architecture based on something called JSON collection plus JSON. That really kind of solves these problems in very cool ways, and we helped PRI build a module that takes their Drupal content and puts it into this. So something to consider when building this is that when building your API or your content solution is that Drupal may just be the editing interface and published to a completely separate API. Certainly not right for one site, but if you have a large, completely distributed organization with multiple different stakeholders and then hundreds of consumers and publishers, might really consider it. Can you build a syndication hub with Drupal as the center of it? Absolutely, and it's definitely been done before. So that may be another way to another option to consider. So last thing that I want to mention is microservices. So we've talked about decoupling the front end and the back end. Well, why stop there? And that's actually that's where a lot of enterprises are starting to look. They have lots of, like, if you think that Drupal is monolithic, start looking at some of the enterprise ERP applications that large corporations have. These are giant monolithic Java applications that do everything for their entire business, right? And so it becomes very difficult for them to make changes to those because they could, everything would fall apart. So this idea of microservices is becoming very popular. So in the case of a content site, in a traditional architecture, all this stuff is all handled in the same application. And with microservices, you break this stuff up. Now, wouldn't be surprised if some of you have kind of taken this approach to at least commenting on the site by using something like Discuss. Discuss is really kind of separates out the commenting for you completely, works as third-party JavaScript, and is SaaS and completely off-site. You could certainly build a commenting system within Drupal that worked in the same way and was architected the same way, and people have done that. And it doesn't have to be off-site, it doesn't have to be a SaaS service. And when you're kind of thinking about all these things, you can start thinking of the different parts of the application that you're building, such as authentication, the content, the CMS, organic groups, if you happen to have them, as separate services, separate applications that work together through APIs. There's huge benefits to that type of architecture, and there's also quite a bit of new work that you would have to do. So it all depends on where those levels of separation you need. That's what I got. It's a lot to think about, and it's all the stuff that I've been thinking about lately. So hopefully you guys have some questions. Yeah.
So specifically going back to the native app server architecture that you talked about with QuickTV and Fallon.
Mm-hmm.
So you pull up the QuickTV site, and frankly, it looks like any other website, and I can envision in my head exactly how I would build it in normal Drupal. So I'm wondering specifically with that architecture and those sites, what was the use case, and what are you doing differently?
Why did we do it?
Why? And yes. Why? Yes. There you go.
Yeah. So the question is, why did we build Twit TV and Jimmy Fallon's site using decoupled architectures? So there's two different answers for the two different sites. For Jimmy Fallon, it was because we didn't have a team that could build it in the time they needed it. From the moment that Jimmy Fallon was going to be the host, and to when they needed the site was shorter than we had people available, and same thing with a lot of the with other Drupal shops that MC was working with. So they went and found an agency that was going to build an awesome site for them, but they had never touched Drupal. They had no Drupal talent. So they, to be able to reach those deadlines, we actually took an API that we had built for the MVC app, made an API for them to consume, and they built the site in Node.js. So
that solved a human problem, not a technical problem.
Yes,
okay.
But that was a problem that needed to be solved, and that was an application for it. For Twit TV, their biggest pain point, they came to us wanting to be able to decouple their site because they wanted to take advantage of the staggered upgrades. They felt very stifled and very gun shy about replatforming their site, but they felt they felt like a big rush to redesign, and that makes a lot of sense. The other thing that comes out of this that maybe I didn't make a big enough point of is that producing that separation of concerns allows you to have a cleaner architecture, and one of the reasons that Drupal is hard to upgrade is because a lot of times that there isn't that wall specifically between what's data and what's a template and how it's going to come together. And when that kind of starts becoming a spaghetti mess, it becomes very difficult to upgrade the site. And even the best places kind of like run into some of those problems because they need to do something quick. If you're building in a decoupled architecture, you literally can't make those mistakes. There's other mistakes you can make. You can't make those. Anybody else? Any other questions?
You have it? Oh, go ahead.
So do you have to pitch this as like, yeah, we're going to make a decoupled solution for you and try to explain it to them, or do they come to you and be like, hey, we want to take advantage of this architecture?
It depends. We don't suggest this to everybody, and we've actually turned people away or turned them towards a more traditional Drupal site. One case was where a small organization that had one developer came to us, and he was super excited about this. We were like, well, are you guys going to hire somebody else? And he wasn't, and he's like, no, I want to do it. I'm going to learn. I'm like, well, hold on, wait a second. This maybe like your entire site, kind of coming in, cold, isn't the best idea. So it really is a mix. We really suggest to people when it's the right architecture for them, and it's going to and they're going to get real benefits from it. We still build traditional Drupal sites, and that's never going to go away. But this is an alternative, and not just one alternative. There's 30 different alternatives here, or I guess an infinite number of alternatives as to how to architect something. Another thing that we've noticed is that there are some performance benefits, and some there's some things that can be simplified about scaling. Yeah?
Presuming your team is scaled up and understands what you're doing, what does it do to time and cost in terms of, so you've got Twit TV, you can build it as a regular Drupal site, or you can solve a pain point for them and say, hey, we're going to do headless for you so that your future upgrades go smoother. What does that do to the short-term time and cost?
The short-term time and costs are generally going to be longer. Yeah, because you do need to build that framework. Now, we actually we open sourced the framework that we used on Twit. It's called Saucier. You can find it on Fork Kitchen's GitHub, and that's more of a starting point. As there's more frameworks available, and as more of this stuff becomes baked, those costs are going to come down. So it's the and actually NBC has seen that, and they're moving a lot of their development into these types of architectures because they have they've built the first one, they've built the first 5, and now they have libraries they can use and tools that they can leverage to be able to really quickly build them. One thing to consider is that you can build an entire site without ever having to build a CMS at all, using services like Contentful or Prismic. And these are, both of those are content as a service SaaS providers. So
They spit out JSON.
They spit out JSON. And the reason I mention them right now is because they also have very good SDKs for consuming that content in the format that they have. There isn't anything like that for Drupal. We're trying to build things like that. And there's other people that are also trying to build things like that. But until there is still that added cost of more framework type work. And it goes with anything in Drupal, like if you're kind of, I don't know, building that new feature in panels that everybody wants but nobody has, right? You're gonna incur additional costs. Yeah?
Just a general question. Do you think this might be a larger trend specifically to like the media industry? Kind of like, because it just seems like, some of the examples you use, it just makes like a lot of sense for that particular industry.
I think it's very true. I think that it is. It has a lot of interest in the media industry. The other place that is, the other places that are interested in it have been big enterprises that have multiple different web properties and sort of, and especially if they're in multiple countries and things like that, and they're starting to think of their content not just as web content or print content, they're thinking of content using something like a syndication hub where all that content is stored, and then different different organizations around the world sort of pull content from that, right? Or they might take product information from one database and then sort of marketing content from another database and put them together and serve them out to a user. And that's certainly happening both like in people coming to us and stuff that I'm reading about.
I think it's also related to this concept of omni-channel marketing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's systems like Adobe Experience Manager that help you, someone's on a website, you're doing something on an account, and you capture their click stream, and now they're on the mobile native app, and you're personalizing the experience based on things they did on the website.
Mm-hmm.
So that stuff kind of start to be able to do that crazy cool stuff.
And start bubbling up into all the different channels that are out
Stuff
there.
you do in one channel carries over to the next channel.
Yep, absolutely. And that is like large and like omni-channel, personalized content. These are all very much on the top of mind of large corporations these days.
Yeah.
Anybody else? I think we're up on time. It'd be overtime. One more question. Nope. All right. Okay. Well, thank you guys for coming.